She could feel the wheels of her chair rolling slower than usual the smooth floor of the airport, somehow feeling heavier today. Maybe it was nerves, or maybe it was the weight of what this day meant. Either way, Samantha was not going to let anything stop her today. She had planned this flight for weeks, double-checked every document, packed every item herself, even called the airline 3 times to make sure everything was arranged, because this was not just any flight, this was the flight that would take her to her sister's wedding, a wedding she thought she would never get to see. Samantha lived with muscular dystrophy, her body weakened over the years by something she never asked for and never wanted, but she learned to live with it. She learned to move through the world with quiet strength and careful planning, and above all with patience, because patience was the only thing she could afford. But today was different. Today, she wanted to feel normal, to feel like any other passenger, to board a plane and land in another city, and hug her sister, and cry and dance, and smile for photographs with her family. But the moment she reached the gate, she noticed something. The staff at the gate were kind. They helped her with paperwork and tagged her wheelchair and made sure she had priority boarding. But as they pushed her toward the jet bridge, something in the air shifted. She crossed the threshold into the plane, and that is when she saw her, the flight attendant. Her name tag said Carla. She had sharp features and sharper eyes, and she looked at Samantha like she had just walked into the wrong place. Samantha smiled and said hello, but Carla did not answer. It was a small thing, a quiet dismissal, but Samantha felt it the way someone feels cold wind through a crack in the window. It was not what Carla did, it was what she did not do, and that silence was loud. As Samantha reached her seat, she asked politely if Carla could help place her small bag in the overhead bin, just a light bag with a sweater, some medication, and her sister's gift. Carla said nothing, walked past her, and started helping a tall man behind Samantha, who had not asked for anything. Maybe she didn't hear. Samantha thought maybe it was nothing. So she asked again, a little louder this time, but Carla turned slightly and said another attendant will help you, and walked off toward the back of the plane. Samantha sat in her seat, slowly, carefully, trying not to let the disappointment show on her face, her bag still resting on her lap. Around her, other passengers talked, laughed, adjusted their seat belts, while she stared quietly at the back of Carla's head, wondering what she had done wrong. She reminded herself to stay calm, reminded herself that people have bad days, that maybe this was just a misunderstanding, but somewhere deep inside she felt it. This was not going to be a normal flight. The plane began to fill slowly, voices echoing across the narrow aisle as passengers shuffled to their seats, some talking, some sighing, some already asleep. But Samantha sat quietly, hands folded over the bag that still rested on her lap. No one had come to help her yet, and Carla, the flight attendant, was now chatting casually with someone in the first row, her laugh dry and sharp like paper sliding across skin. Samantha did not want to cause trouble. She never had. She believed in kindness, in being patient, in giving people the benefit of the doubt, but something about this moment felt different, not louder but heavier, as if the small injustices of the day were beginning to collect inside her like tiny stones in her pocket. Another passenger passed by and offered a polite smile, an older woman, maybe in her 70s, who gently asked, "Do you need help with that?" Samantha smiled back and said softly, "Thank you. But I think someone is supposed to help me soon." The woman nodded and moved on, but Samantha could see the concern in her eyes. The engines began to hum, a soft vibration rolled under the floor, and the plane backed away from the gate. The overhead lights dimmed, and the captain's voice came on, welcoming everyone and asking the crew to prepare for departure. Carla's voice followed shortly, cold and mechanical, as she gave the safety instructions, her eyes never once scanning in Samantha's direction. As the plane climbed, Samantha stared out the window, watching the ground fall away, the lights turning to dots and the roads to threads, and for a brief moment she let herself feel the excitement again, the hope that this trip would mean something, that this flight was more than just a journey, but a step towards something joyful. Then her muscles tensed, a dull ache creeping into her arms and legs. It was time to take her medication. She had been holding off, waiting for things to settle. But now the pressure in the cabin and the stress in her body were too much. She reached into her bag, but the cramped seat made it difficult to open the zipper. She leaned slightly, tried to lift it, but her grip failed her, and the bag tumbled gently to the floor. She pressed the call button. A small light blinked above her seat. She waited 1 minute, 2 minutes. No one came. She pressed it again, her breathing tightening a little now. She needed her medicine. She needed someone to bring her water. She needed someone to care, even just for a moment. Finally, Carla appeared from behind the curtain. Her arms crossed, her expression blank. Yes. She said. Samantha spoke carefully. Can I please have some water and help picking up my bag? It has my medication, and I cannot reach it. Carla stared at her for a second too long, then said medication should be taken before boarding, and walked away without looking back. Samantha sat frozen, unsure if she had heard that correctly. She blinked once slowly, as if trying to clear the moment from her eyes, but it stayed. The light above her seat still blinked quietly, like a signal no one wanted to see. The blinking light above her seat eventually turned off on its own, but Carla never returned, and Samantha sat still, quietly, hands folded again, as if she was trying to keep herself from falling apart. On the inside, she could feel the pain in her arms, now building from the effort of simply holding herself upright too long, too still, too unnoticed. Outside the window, the sky had turned a soft grey clouds, stretching in every direction, and inside the cabin, the mood had shifted. Passengers were settling in for the flight. Screens, glowing blankets pulled up around shoulders, drinks being served, cartwheels clicking softly over the thin carpet, and yet Samantha remained invisible. Her water never came. Her bag remained on the floor, her medication untouched inside it. Minutes passed, then more, and slowly her body began to feel heavier, her muscles tightening in a way that made her breath catch in her throat. She knew what was coming. She had felt it before on long days when she pushed herself too far, too fast, the early signs of a muscle lock. She leaned forward slowly, carefully, and tried again to lift the bag, but her hands refused to close, her fingers curling halfway, then giving up. It was not just pain now, it was fear that something small might turn into something serious up here in the air, far from anyone who really knew how to help her. She pressed the call button again, hoping maybe a different attendant would respond this time. The light blinked again, and she waited 1 minute too. Then Carla appeared again, her face unreadable, her arms still crossed like before. Samantha looked up, her voice smaller than she meant it to be. I really need help. I cannot reach my bag, and I feel my muscles tightening. I need my medication now, please. Carla looked down for a moment, then said, you should have thought of that before you boarded. If you need that much help, maybe flying is not the right choice for you. She said it quietly, but clearly enough that the man in the next row turned his head. The woman across the aisle glanced over, but no one said anything. Carla turned and walked away again without waiting for a reply, and Samantha was left alone again in a seat that suddenly felt like a cage. She blinked slowly again, trying not to cry, not because it hurt, although it did not because she was angry, although she was, but because she felt something worse than either. She felt helpless, and that was something she had fought her whole life to never feel again. As the hum of the engine filled her ears, she looked down at the floor, at the small black bag lying just out of reach, and then out the window again, and wondered how far she still had to go, how much longer she would have to stay quiet, how much longer she would have to wait for someone to see her. The lights in the cabin dimmed as the plane settled into cruising altitude. A soft glow wrapped the rows of passengers like a blanket, but Samantha felt none of it. She sat perfectly still, her hands curled in her lap, her back pressed into the seat, her eyes fixed on the overhead bin where her bag should have been. Instead, it was still on the floor just out of reach, and her fingers had stopped responding now. They would not open fully. They would not close. She could not even reach for the call button again. Not that it mattered, because the last 2 times it had done nothing. Her body had begun to betray her slowly, subtly, but steadily. Her legs tingled, her arms felt distant, and her breathing grew shallow, not because of panic, but because the muscles around her chest were tightening as they sometimes did, when her condition pushed too far too long without rest or medication. And still no one came. Until the woman across the aisle looked again, really looked this time, her eyes narrowing slightly as she leaned towards Samantha and asked softly, "Do you need help, dear?" Samantha hesitated. She had been trying so hard not to be a burden, but her lips parted, and she whispered yes. Without hesitation, the woman reached down and lifted the small black bag, placing it gently on Samantha's lap. Samantha whispered "thank you," and began trying to unzip it slowly, awkwardly, her fingers barely working as she fumbled through until she felt the familiar shape of the bottle. The woman was already calling over another attendant, a younger man with nervous eyes who approached with hesitation, and the woman said sharply, "This lady needs water now, and she needs help. And where is the other one, the one who ignored her?" The attendant looked confused, then hurried off down the aisle, and now for the first time heads began to turn. Passengers started to whisper low questions, floating between seats. What happened? Who is she talking about? Is someone sick? Samantha took a deep breath, just one, but it felt like the first breath she had taken in hours, like air, was finally reaching places that had gone quiet inside her. Then Carla returned her expression tight, her mouth pressed into a line, as she addressed the older woman. "Is there a problem here?" "Yes, there is," the woman replied clearly. "This young lady asked you for help more than once, and you ignored her." Carla said something about policies and procedures, about limited assistance and personal responsibility, but her words felt thin, in the air weak, and suddenly a man from 2 rows back stood up and said loudly, "I saw her press the button twice, and you walked away." Another voice chimed in, then another, and slowly the silence that had protected Carla began to break, and Samantha sat there in the middle of it, not saying a word, just holding the bottle in her lap, as if it were the only thing keeping her connected to the moment. And outside the window the clouds kept moving, but inside the cabin something had shifted, the kind of shift you can feel in your chest when you know someone has finally seen you. The whispers had started quietly at first, just murmurs between the passengers in the rows around her, but now they were spreading through the cabin like wildfire. People were talking, looking back over their shoulders, some speaking in hushed voices, some not even bothering to lower their tone at all, and Samantha felt it building, slowly rising like the air pressure before a storm. A man from 3 rows back stood up and asked Carla what the problem was. She had just walked away from a passenger who needed help. Didn't she see that, he said, raising his voice, but still not quite yelling. It was clear now that others had heard it too, and they weren't just going to sit back. The attendant's face was a mask, stiff and unreadable, but Samantha could see the tension in her eyes for the first time. Something had cracked, something was slipping, and for the first time since boarding, Samantha felt something like hope creeping in a small voice inside her, whispering that maybe she would be okay. Maybe someone would see her. After all, the older woman across the aisle was still watching Carla with a stern gaze, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if daring Carla to speak again, her voice sharp and clear. "You were rude to her. You didn't even look at her when she asked for help, and now you're hiding behind policies like it's going to protect you." And then the young man from earlier who had taken Samantha's bag leaned over the back of his seat and said, "I don't know how you could just ignore someone like that. Are you really okay with treating someone like that?" A few others joined in, adding their voices, their words, like stones hitting the water, making ripples that spread wider with each second. And Samantha just sat still, frozen in her seat, her heart pounding in her chest, as she felt the weight of their words settle over Carla, her face flushed with a deepening shade of red. But it wasn't just Carla who was feeling the heat now. Samantha's phone buzzed quietly in her pocket. It was a message from her sister, just a short text, but enough to make her eyes fill with tears again. It read, "I'm thinking of you, I hope you're okay, and I can't wait to see you." It was everything Samantha had wanted to hear, and everything she had been afraid she might not get to feel today. A simple message from someone who cared, from someone who would be there for her. And it broke something open inside her, the final crack that let the tears come. She wiped them away, quickly, not wanting to make a scene. But still, outside the plane, the clouds had grown darker. The storm that had been coming now arrived with a kind of sudden change that could make you think the world was turning upside down inside the cabin. The voices were growing louder with every second, and Carla could no longer ignore it. She could no longer act as though nothing had happened. She was no longer in control, and Samantha realized with a sense of shock and disbelief that for the first time in this entire flight, it wasn't her that felt small anymore. It was hard to tell who spoke first, but the tension was no longer just between Samantha and Carla. It had spread through the entire cabin. It had become a collective sense of wrongness, a shared feeling that something wasn't right. And now the quiet discomfort had turned into something undeniable. Passengers were standing up from their seats, whispering loudly, calling for a supervisor, the pressure mounting with every passing second. The young man who had spoken earlier stood again and said loudly, "This is unacceptable. The flight attendant shouldn't be treating anyone like this, especially not someone who clearly needs assistance." Other passengers murmured in agreement, their voices growing stronger by the moment. And Samantha could feel their words surrounding her like a shield, keeping her from the isolation that had felt so heavy just moments ago. Carla stood at the front of the cabin, still behind the beverage cart, her face flushed and stiff, her eyes darting from one passenger to the next, as if searching for something to hold onto. Her hands gripped the cart tightly, as though it might anchor her to the ground. But the truth was that the weight of what was happening was now too much for her to carry alone. Samantha could feel the heat of the moment in the air, every word like a wave crashing against Carla's resolve. She could feel it pushing her down and forcing her to face the truth that what she had done was wrong. The humiliation was starting to sink in, and there was no hiding from it now. Then the captain's voice broke through the noise, the announcement crisp and clear: "I need all passengers to return to their seats immediately. We are preparing for a change in the flight plan." The voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the urgency behind it, and Carla's stiff posture suddenly relaxed, just a little, as she glanced toward the cockpit. It was the kind of attention that comes when you know things have gone too far, when you realize you've lost control of the situation, and the only thing left is to face what comes next. Within minutes, the plane began to descend, and Samantha's heart skipped a beat as she felt the familiar pressure in her chest tighten. She had been so focused on everything around her that she had almost forgotten that they were heading toward their destination. Now that this strange silent battle was nearing its end, she felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Her sister's wedding was so close, and yet the events of the flight had left her feeling small and exhausted in a way that no one could understand. A flight attendant approached quietly, this one a woman with a softer look and a gentler tone. She asked Samantha if she needed help again, and Samantha nodded, her voice small, "Thank you." But the woman was already moving past her, asking for her bag, gently this time. No harsh words, no cold shoulders, just someone who cared enough to finally do what was right. It was only then that Samantha realized how much she had wanted this kindness, how much she had needed it to feel like she wasn't invisible. Outside the window, the clouds had parted, revealing a clear blue sky. The storm that had threatened to break had finally passed, and now the plane was gently touching down on the runway. The plane touched down with a smooth thud, and Samantha's heart thudded with it. She hadn't realized how tightly wound she had been until now. The soft hum of the plane slowing its descent was like a release, like the pressure inside her chest was lifting bit by bit. but there was still the weight of everything that had happened lingering around her. The younger flight attendant, who had helped her moments earlier, knelt down beside her and asked if she needed anything else. Samantha shook her head a little too quickly. "No, I'm okay. Just please let me get off this plane as soon as I can." The attendant nodded understanding, but there was still a spark of concern in her eyes before she stood and moved toward the front of the cabin to prepare for deboarding. Samantha watched her go, feeling the ache in her legs start to make its presence known again. The long flight had taken its toll, and the muscle lock was creeping back in. But she could wait a little longer, just a little longer, until they were off the plane, and she could get some space. As the passengers began to stand and collect their bags, the tension in the cabin eased, but Samantha could still feel the eyes of the others on her, not in a bad way, but in a way that made her realize how many had been silently supporting her throughout the flight, how many had silently taken her side, even though they hadn't said a word. The older woman from earlier smiled at her as she passed by. "I'm glad you're okay," she said softly, and Samantha returned the smile with a nod of thanks. When the flight attendants finally began the process of letting passengers off, Carla remained behind the others, her head lowered, her expression unreadable. But there was no hiding the shift in her posture now. It was clear she had been rattled by the public outcry, and Samantha couldn't help but notice the way she stood at the back of the line, no longer the authority figure, no longer the one in control, just another person among the crowd. It was as if the weight of the entire flight had shifted in an instant, and Samantha realized that she had witnessed something she hadn't expected, not just the breakdown of one flight attendant, but the breaking of an invisible wall that people often face when they feel unseen and unheard. The passengers walked past her one by one, the ones who had spoken up still giving her a kind word, a soft glance, their words comforting like a balm on a wound that hadn't fully healed, but was finally being treated. When Samantha finally reached the jet bridge and stepped out onto solid ground, she felt the cool air hit her face, and for the first time that day she took a deep breath and let it out slowly, letting the tension slide off her shoulders like a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying. She thought of her sister's wedding just ahead of her and felt a new sense of strength rising inside her, not from the drama of the flight or the confrontation, but from the quiet realization that she had stood her ground without raising her voice, without becoming angry. She had stayed calm and had found her voice in a way she hadn't expected. And as she walked toward the gate, she smiled to herself, knowing she had survived the flight and something else too. She had taken back control of her journey, and nothing would ever make her feel small again. The terminal was bustling with the usual chaos of arriving flights, passengers rushing by, taxis waiting in lines, people talking on their phones all around her. Samantha could feel the rhythm of the world around her, but for the first time in a long while she felt fully present, as if every step she took was her own and not dictated by the flight or the people she had just left behind. Her mind wandered back to the plane and the faces of the passengers who had spoken up for her, the woman who had helped her with the bag, the man who had raised his voice, and the others who had added their support. Their small acts of courage had rippled out and made a difference in a way she hadn't expected. And now it felt like the first breath of freedom. As she passed through the airport, her phone buzzed again, this time a message from her sister. "I'm waiting for you at the gate." And Samantha smiled. She couldn't wait to see her. The moment was so close. The long journey was almost over, and now the flight felt like a distant memory. She thought back to the moment on the plane when Carla had walked away, when she had looked at Samantha like she didn't matter at all. It had hurt, but it had also given her something she didn't expect, a chance to show herself what she was really capable of. She had stayed calm. She had handled the situation without losing control, without becoming someone she didn't want to be. And that was something to be proud of. Walking toward the gate, she felt lighter, her steps sure and steady. It wasn't about the flight anymore. It was about what came after it, about the people she loved, and the life waiting for her beyond this moment. It wasn't about the injustice of the flight, or the way she had been treated. It was about how she had risen above it, and how in the end the universe had a way of balancing the scales. Behind her, as she made her way through the crowd, she saw 2 security officers walking toward the gate ahead of her, and the thought struck her that Carla's actions would have consequences, no matter how much she tried to bury them. The other flight attendants might have taken the fall for her today, but Samantha knew the airline would have to act in the end. They couldn't just ignore what had happened, not after the passengers had spoken up, not after everything that had been said. As she neared her gate, she finally saw her sister, standing there waving with excitement, her face lighting up. When she saw Samantha step into view, the tension of the flight seemed to disappear in an instant, replaced with the warmth of home, the comfort of family. Samantha walked over to her sister and hugged her tightly. She let herself relax for the first time since the flight began, feeling the relief in her chest as her sister whispered, "I'm so glad you made it." And Samantha replied quietly, "I am too." This moment was hers, the one that had been waiting for her through the whole journey, the one where she could finally leave everything behind and move forward into something new, into something better.